The prevalence of obesity has been significantly increasing since the 1980s. The National Center for Health Statistics data from 2015 and 16 reports that 39.6% of adult Americans over the age of 20 are obese, and as many as 74.7% are regarded as either overweight or obese. So, what is going on? Well, coincidentally, we know that by the late 1970s and early 80s, chronic dieting, extreme dieting was actually becoming very popular. It was not that there was a medical epiphany and weight loss diets were the new therapeutic modality. In fact, weight loss diets had been the main therapeutic modality for weight management problems as far back as Hippocrates, and still today it's the single most utilized weight management strategy. Yet, studies have found that caloric-restrictive diets, despite causing rapid and significant weight loss over the short term, are not efficacious in sustaining weight loss over the long term. A review by Tracy Mann and colleagues illustrates this point.
A comprehensive review by Mann and colleagues, published in American Psychologist in April 2007, concludes that one of the most important conditions for weight gain in later years and persistent form of weight problem is previous dieting. This seems almost inconsistent with basic logic. The research basically concludes that dieting causes weight gain. This does not make too much sense, or does it? In the review, Mann and colleagues found that weight loss programs consistently report a loss of 5 to 10% of body weight over the short term, but significant weight regain in the follow-up period. Overall, they report that 33 to 67% of subjects regained more weight than lost.
So the question that our team asked is whether or not the chronic and severe dieting experienced by the younger population is creating such a severe loss or erosion of lean mass that it's precipitating sarcopenia. Well, let's begin with the definition. And certainly sarcopenia is most prominently found among the elderly, and it usually occurs because of a lack of physical activity, from which we find muscle atrophy, and will also occur from malnutrition, if long enough, will lead to muscle or protein erosion. So through lack of weight-bearing exercises, sarcopenia and skeletal muscle frailty can arise, especially among the elderly, and this has been very well documented. Now, internationally, there's a consensus that the loss of muscle mass is really central in the diagnosing of sarcopenia and used along with appendicular skeletal mass, ASM, or appendicular lean mass, ALM, as an indirect measure of function. Now, there are three techniques relying on ASM in the determination of sarcopenia. First, the appendicular skeletal mass, or ASM, divided by height squared, the appendicular skeletal mass divided by the total body weight, and the appendicular skeletal mass divided by the body mass index. The proposed model for sarcopenia in the obese is associated with an erosion of fat-free mass that occurs with dieting, leading to hyperphagia with the intent of restoring lost fat-free mass, but invariably also causing collateral fat synthesis. Consequently, a disproportionate fat accumulation relative to fat-free mass ensues. Now, this cumulative effect of collateral lipogenesis occurring with frequent dieting may be etiologically behind the rise of sarcopenic obesity in middle-aged adults. Rossi and co-workers, in studying the impact of weight cycling on middle-aged adults, concluded that in severe weight cyclers there was a 3.8 times higher risk of lower muscle mass and a 5.2 greater risk of sarcopenia compared to non-weight cyclers, measuring ASM over the BMI and hand grip strength. Work by Bei and Kim and by Peng Chea-Kul identified surprisingly high levels of sarcopenia among relatively young subjects. Notably, they found an 11 to 26% prevalence among the 20 to 39-year-olds, and a 27 to 52% prevalence among the 40 to 64-year-olds using the skeletal mass index. Now, this method consists of dividing the skeletal mass by the body mass. So the question has to be asked, why is sarcopenia occurring in the young? Well, we've established essentially four causes. The rise in pediatric obesity occurring also concurrently with the rise in type 2 diabetes, the chronic dieting taking place at younger ages, and a decline in physical activity. So we made an attempt at theorizing what was actually taking place, and we advanced that a significant loss of fat-free mass occurring in chronic weight loss and regain cycles make it very difficult to lose weight with time in particular types of patients. There's a consensus that with weight loss, there's a downward adaptive thermogenesis that's occurring, which leads to a decrease in resting energy expenditure, followed by a weight regain after weight loss. Now, this creates a vicious cycle of weight loss and regain that keep many in a perpetual excess weight problem. This would be particularly true as the proportion of fat increases in the body relative to the lean body mass, making it, of course, more difficult to lose weight with calorie restrictions. So we conducted two experiments. In the first experiment, we hypothesized that there would be really a decline in the fat-free mass and an increase in the fat mass and a significant decline in resting energy expenditure among college women. And this would explain the difficulty with losing weight. In the second experiment, we wanted to identify in a broader age range of women whether or not a screening questionnaire could detect with high sensitivity and specificity women that actually had sarcopenic obesity. So in the first experiment, we measured fat mass using plethysmography and derived from that the fat-free mass, and then we measured resting energy expenditure through indirect calorimetry. So again, in this first experiment, we were curious to see whether chronic dieting could actually bring down the fat-free mass and whether or not that could produce a visible decline in resting energy expenditure. So what we saw is as we went for obese infrequent dieters to obese chronic dieters, we saw that the fat mass did in fact increase in these groups. But we also saw that the fat-free mass was also increasing in these obese and chronic dieting groups. When we measured the REE, the indirect calorimetry, we could not find any differences between the controls, the infrequent dieters who are obese, and the chronic dieters who are obese. However, when we look at the percent of the fat-free mass relative to the total body weight, we can see that in the obese chronic dieters, the fat-free mass is significantly smaller than the controls. So two things to observe in this table. The first I highlight is the resting energy expenditure measured by indirect calorimetry. And what we see here is that there's a high coefficient of variability, varying around 11% in the controls, but as soon as you hit the obese dieters, we're looking at 17 to close to 20% coefficient variability. So not a very useful clinical tool. The various equations used to estimate resting energy expenditure do correlate fairly well with the REE, but for the most part, because of the large coefficient of variability in the REE, they're not very useful in being able to detect sarcopenia. In the second experiment, 24 women ages 19 to 59 completed an obesity screening that assessed total body weight, percent fat mass, percent fat-free mass using the BOD-POD, and also bioelectrical impedance using specifically the in-body 720. The resting energy expenditure was determined using indirect calorimetry, and the basal metabolic rate was indirectly calculated using the BIA. The subjects completed a screening questionnaire that was developed by our team that consisted of questions pertaining first to a self-assessment of weight, second to the family history of weight problems going back to the grandparents, third to the subject's dieting practices. In this way, the classification of obese or sarcopenic obese reflected infrequent and chronic dieting respectively. The following slide demonstrates how the questionnaire then was able to organize the different subjects. First, the controls were healthy weight individuals that weren't really dieting, no history of obesity. The obese group were those that for which there was an obesity problem, but not necessarily a long familial history, and the SOB, sarcopenic obesities, were those with a longer history of obesity in the family and of chronic dieting. So now first we found a significant decline in the resting energy expenditure when corrected for body weight. So we saw that in the third column, and we also found a significant decline in the basal metabolic rate divided also by the total body weight. We also found a significant decline in the appendicular skeletal mass, the ASM, relative to the body mass index, a newer sort of form of measurement used for fat-free mass erosion. And what we found is that the ratio was significantly lower in the obese, the OB group, but we also found that in the SOB group, that value was even lower than in the OB group. What is also significant is when we look at the fat-free mass relative to the total body weight, and we can see that in the OB group, that value declined significantly compared to controls, and when we look at the SOB group, the sarcopenic group, that value is also smaller than controls, but also even smaller than the OB group. Now, when we look at the appendicular skeletal mass relative to the body weight, a measurement very similar to the skeletal mass index that we saw earlier as an approved measurement of sarcopenia, we see that the obese definitely has a smaller value, but very particularly here, we see that the sarcopenic obese group actually has a value that is more than 2 standard deviations below the controls, which is a measurement sufficiently low to be recognized, according to Jensen and some other researchers, as sarcopenic. If we look at the far right of the table, we see the score that's generated by the screening questionnaire, and that score increases, as you can see, in tandem with the severity of the obesity. So we wanted to know if the score was at all sensitive to the measurement of the basal metabolic rate, the BMR, and so we plotted the BMR relative to the total body weight on the ordinate versus the score on the abscesses. And as you can see, we had an R-square of 0.885, which meant that as we moved towards the right on the abscesses with an increasing score, we can see that there is in fact a decline or a decrease in the basal metabolic rate relative to the total body weight. When we plotted the fat-free mass relative to total body weight relative to the screening score, we found a very similar relationship than what we saw with the BMR corrected for total body weight, with an R-square here of 0.85. We measured both the sensitivity and the specificity of the questionnaire and found a sensitivity of 83% and a specificity of 87%. So we can conclude that the screening questionnaire that we developed was sensitive enough to detect sarcopenia among the obese, and this should allow healthcare providers and dietitians to prescribe other things than caloric restrictive diets for the management of a continuous chronic weight problem.